Welcome back. Straight to the news that the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu took to the airwaves earlier on to announce that he's putting his judicial reform plans on hold. Well, those planned reforms have triggered Israel's worst national security crisis in years, resulting in months of angry protests, including today. Well, tens of thousands of people were out on the streets of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, waving the country's blue and white flag. Those protests carrying on as we speak. Well, opponents of the judicial reform plan call it a threat to democracy. Well, let's get some more analysis now from Dr. Dalia Scheindlin, who is a political analyst, pollster and contributor to Haaretz, who joins us now from Tel Aviv. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Do you think that pausing this reform of the judiciary is going to be enough to calm the protesters?
Well, it's very hard to know because the protesters are under no illusions that pausing it does not mean it's completely over. And the protesters, well, some of the figures of the protests and the opposition have already said that they would really not back down until the government promises that it is what we call shelving the legislation entirely, whereas the government is now saying, Netanyahu has said, we are going to give a chance for deliberations, dialogue, we will restart this process in the summer. And, I think that it might lead to a pause in the protests in the short term, probably for the Jewish holiday, which is coming up of Passover. But I think it's too soon to say that the protesters will actually go away because there is very, very little trust in anything Netanyahu, is promising. And I think there is, if it wasn't clear before this government was established, it is very clear to the protesters now that the government is dead set on getting some version of this reforms through.
Yeah, and as you've been speaking, we've been looking at those protests continuing there. I think those pictures coming into us from Tel Aviv. So clearly, the anger hasn't disappeared altogether. We had a reporter earlier who suggested that perhaps there was a tactic here by Benjamin Netanyahu, who has painted himself into a corner. And that tactic is to try to delay this, make people perhaps start thinking about something else, and perhaps push through these reforms during the summer holidays when people are a little bit distracted. Do you think there is a little bit of a bit of that strategy at work here?
Absolutely. I mean, it could really go both ways. The way I see it, one of the possibilities is that what your reporter implied, which is that when people are to some extent away on vacation. And I think we need to take into account, this may sound strange, but it's very hot in Israel in July and August. And it's not clear to me that you would have the same numbers of people who would really be able to come out during the day all the time, protesting in the hot sun, even at night. It might be very hard to get these kinds of numbers. And as you say, some people are away. But there is also a possibility that delaying the legislation means the opposite. It might never get through. And that's because we have a lot of instability in Israeli politics, as anybody who's been following this region would know. There's no way to be sure from the government's perspective that delaying it would not actually kill it. And that's one of the reasons why the government has been so resistant to delaying it up until now.
I gather you weren't so very far away from where some of those protests were happening today. Just tell us what the mood was out on the streets of Tel Aviv. I mean, and do you think that now that this has been announced, there will be a sense of vindication, and this is a victory for democracy in Israel?
Well, victory, I wouldn't say, because as we just pointed out, the legislation is not over. And this government, I think that there are also no illusions that the legislation to reform the judiciary is just one piece of this government's intentions. They have many other pieces of legislation that they would like to pass that involve all sorts of violations of liberal and democratic principles. And so they want to move ahead with those. They would like to, for example, legalize various forms of discrimination in the public sphere. They would like to rebuild settlements and eventually annex, all sorts of things they want to do. So I wouldn't say it's exactly a victory, but as your visuals show very nicely, the main feeling in the evening was less about anger and more about a sense of victory, at least for the very immediate moment, because they managed to force the state to a standstill. They managed to paralyze the government. They managed to expose Netanyahu's disarray and the sense that the government is chaotic and not able to actually manage the country nor even pass the reforms that it wanted to. And so there is a bit of a sense of celebratory sense among the protesters by the end of the day. But at night, last night, after Netanyahu fired the defense minister, the mood was extremely angry. People flooded the streets and the highways and completely choked off the highways all throughout the night. and they were still there, or at least they had been replaced by the next, changing of the guard of protesters. By early this morning, there were protests already as early as 7 and 8 and 8:30 this morning. I went to some of them to see. And this afternoon at the demonstrations in Jerusalem, where I also went, many people were bleary-eyed because they had been awake all night. And there was a lot of anger, but also a very broad sense of solidarity, simply because the numbers and the breadth of the protesters, the fact that they span different political communities, is so strong. Then again, this evening, for the first time, the coalition's supporters, the far right, citizens who support these reforms, finally staged their own first significant demonstration this evening in Jerusalem as well. So there's still a sense of, two different forces within the population who are, really pitted heavily against one another. But I would say this evening, from the perspective of protesters, there's a sense that they have achieved something, which is why you see them dancing in the streets.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see them dancing in the streets as you're speaking. We get the impression here, a very long way away from Israel, that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is rather isolated. But as you suggested, and as we've seen with some counter demonstrations today, he does have support for these judicial reforms, albeit not mainstream support. But how significant would you say that level of support is for the Prime Minister?
Well, I don't think he's particularly isolated within his political communities. Remember, his party is still pretty solidly behind him. The defense minister was the only one who was willing to go public and say he wants to postpone the legislation. And all the other Likud members and ministers basically said, we will support whatever Netanyahu decides to do if he should decide to pause on the legislation. They're making a very clear statement that they're not going against Netanyahu. That was certainly part of Netanyahu's intention in firing the defense minister, was a threat to the others. Don't cross me. In terms of the public, it really is divided in the middle. I think we can't overstate the fact that 48% of Israeli voters, just over 48% of all Israeli voters, voted for this coalition. It's not exactly a majority, but it's a big part of the population. And it's true that the protests really sweep across different segments of society, including, we all realize, some of the people who support the coalition. But I think that he's developed a mindset where he convinces himself that his supporters are, a big enough part of society and solid enough at the political level that I don't think he feels a sense of isolation. And that, I think, empowers him to continue doing what he's doing.
OK, just last question briefly, if you will. No sense, therefore, that Benjamin Netanyahu might be considering his political future and might perhaps resign, as some people have demanded that he does.
Some people have demanded that, but it is certainly not in Netanyahu's habit to resign. He doesn't resign very often in life. The last time, I remember him resigning was in 1999. That's a long time ago. And believe me, he's faced many crises since then. I think that his overriding goal is to stay in office as long as humanly possible.
OK, well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to talk to us. Political analyst Dr. Dalia Scheindlin in Tel Aviv. Thank you very much indeed.